So we're going to continue in this session with the compassion wing of practice. So we saw in the foundation level, as exemplified by the Theravada Buddhist traditions, this compassion wing of practice is cultivating these four immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And what I'd like to do today is start to have a look at this compassion wing within the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. And that's this idea of bodhicitta. So to understand how that fits into the picture, we can go back to our booklets, to that three vehicles chart that we briefly looked at the other day. So we saw there that in the Theravada Buddhist vehicle, which is really based on these Four Noble Truths teachings, and of course the Theravada Buddhist traditions are the ones where, when Buddhism spread from India through the Pali language, where it spread to Sri Lanka, up to Myanmar, and across Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and so forth. In the Four Noble Truths teachings, of course, the third noble truth, the truth of cessation, the ending of all suffering and its causes, is this goal of nirvana. So in Theravada traditions, the final goal of spiritual path is nirvana, our own liberation from suffering. And when we achieve that goal, we become known as an arhat. And of course, to strive for that goal, we need to develop the aspiration for that goal. And that here is translated as renunciation. In Sanskrit, nisarana, which is really this wish for liberation from suffering. So actually this is compassion for ourselves. And we saw here that to strive for the goal of nirvana, on the basis of this aspiration of renunciation, this sort of compassion for ourselves, we engage in these eightfold path, these practices, which can be condensed into these three core areas of practice, of ethics, concentration, wisdom. And we saw here that the wisdom or vipassana practice were these three marks of existence. We see that in the last column there. So we are to come into this insight into impermanence, which of course will help us to dramatically reduce our attachment, our aversion, and so forth. To come to realize suffering or dukkha, which is really going to then help us to really effectively develop this renunciation. And then this wisdom of no self, that there's no autonomous me here. This grasping to self was considered to be the fundamental ignorance, the root distorted view. So if we can realize no self, we can then move along the stages of the path and achieve this goal of nirvana. But then, of course, we can understand that, well, we're not the only ones stuck in this situation of dukkha, cycling in this existence called samsara, this cycle of existence called samsara. Everyone else is in the same situation as us. So then we can take this renunciation to another level and not only aspire to be free of suffering ourselves, but to go on to develop the aspiration to help others to be free of that as well. But of course, if we look at how we can help others now, we can understand, well, I'm not really much use to others because I have my own issues to deal with. You know, I've got a lot of mental afflictions and suffering is myself. So I don't really have much ability to help others right now. And then we can understand, well, okay, how can I really be effective in helping others? Is if I achieve full awakening. If I eliminate all my mental afflictions and suffering and fully develop my positive qualities, then I can really be effective in helping others. And that's bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is that aspiration for full awakening so that we can help liberate others from suffering. So this word bodhicitta again is a Sanskrit term which we can divide into two. Bodhi in Sanskrit is enlightenment. And chitta is mind. So bodhicitta is literally the mind of enlightenment. It's the mind which aspires to enlightenment for the welfare of others, so that we can help to liberate others from suffering. So there are actually, in bodhicitta, there are two aspirations. The aspiration for our own enlightenment and the aspiration to help liberate everyone else from suffering. And when we talk about bodhicitta, we can talk about two types of bodhicitta. There's what's called aspiring bodhicitta and engaging bodhicitta. And to understand the difference between these two, we can use an analogy. If we want to go to some destination, first we need to develop the wish to go, and then we need to actually go. So if we want to get to the destination of enlightenment, first we need to develop the wish to go there, that's aspiring bodhicitta, and then we actually need to take steps to get there, which is engaging bodhicitta. So aspiring bodhicitta is simply developing that aspiration, may I achieve enlightenment for the benefit of others. Engaging bodhicitta is then all the practices that we do together with that aspiration that helps us to actually move towards that goal. So then first we need to cultivate aspiring bodhicitta. And there are a number of ways in which we can do that. And there were two main, in the meditation texts, the ancient Indian and Tibetan meditation texts, there were two main methods that were taught in how to cultivate this bodhicitta. The first one, and the one that was most commonly taught, was the 7 cause and effect method. As the name suggests, there were 7 steps in that. A second technique was taught, called Equalizing and Exchanging Self with Others. This is a 5-step method. But historically, that was generally considered too difficult for the average person. And so this is the one that was most widely taught. However, I think in our modern society, this first method could be potentially a little bit difficult to use for 2 reasons, which I'll look at shortly. And actually, I think probably the second technique for many of us in the modern world will be the more effective technique. And so what I'd like to do then is just then briefly outline this technique so we just basically know what the steps are. But then we'll look at this approach in more detail, because I think for many of us this is probably going to be the better approach. So let's first briefly look at this 7 cause and effect method and why potentially it could be a little bit difficult for us to implement that. Actually, before we go into that, let's just finish a little bit here in the chart. So what we see then is in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, which coming through the Sanskrit language, so here we're saying that the final goal of the spiritual path is full enlightenment. And if we achieve that goal, we become known as a Buddha. And again, to aspire for that goal, we need to cultivate this aspiration of bodhicitta. When we cultivate this aspiration of bodhicitta, we become known as a bodhisattva. Again, in bodhisattva, bodhi means enlightenment. Sattva here means courage or strength. So a bodhisattva is someone who has the courage or strength to strive for enlightenment. And then that bodhisattva eventually becomes enlightened and becomes Buddha. And what are the practices that we need to engage in to strive for that goal of enlightenment? Here are listed the 6 perfections. Things like generosity, ethics, patience, joyous effort, concentration, wisdom. But like the Noble Eightfold Path, these 6 perfections can be condensed into the same 3 core areas of practice. For example, generosity, ethics and patience can be condensed as ethics. And then we have concentration and wisdom. And joyous effort is something we need to apply to all 3. So also in Mahayana, we have the same 3 core areas of practice of ethics, concentration, wisdom. And of course here wisdom, or vipassana practice, as we see in that last column, we're really mainly talking about this wisdom of emptiness. This wisdom realizing nothing exists independently. And that's something we're going to be discussing in a little bit of detail on day 9 of this retreat. So therefore, with the motivation of bodhicitta, engaging in these 6 perfections practices, particularly this wisdom of emptiness, we can move along the path to the goal of enlightenment. But of course, before we can move along the path, we first need to have the aspiration to achieve that goal. And that's what we're looking at now. Any questions about this chart on the Mahayana before we go to this? Yeah.
Yesterday you just explained what it's the Theravada, the renunciation. You told us it's not this. What is exactly? I forgot.
Right. So yesterday I mentioned that this word renunciation actually is not a good translation, but someone used it many years ago and it sort of stuck. Because it's translating this Sanskrit term here, nisarana, and the prefix ni Nih, means out of or away from. And sarana is coming from the root sir, means to move, to go. So nisarana is the aspiration to move out of, to move away from suffering towards liberation. So nisarana is actually the aspiration for liberation from suffering. So that's what this word renunciation is translating.
Yes, but how it's come on the practical life, I mean. Like I read Pema Chadron a lot.
Because now...
She says renunciate. She wrote it
right.
in the middle of dealing with an
sure.
emotion.
Sure. So now our worldview is generally the cause, the source of my suffering is there, the source of my happiness is there. So that's why we end up with a lot of attachment to pleasant things and aversion to unpleasant things, because we believe that that's where the source of happiness and suffering is from. So if we have that as our worldview, then we're stuck, because all we're going to do is create more suffering. We're never going to find liberation from suffering. So therefore, we are to reflect on the first two noble truths, and in particular here in the Vipassana practice to reflect on suffering, on dukkha, to come to realise there's no genuine happiness out there, and that actually the source of suffering is not out there either, it's in our own mind. And if we can come to that insight, then we'll understand, well, okay, I can overcome this source of suffering, this ignorance and mental afflictions. I can be liberated. Then that will lead to this renunciation. So often in these contexts where teachers are talking about renunciation, what they're really meaning, that often when we hear the word renunciation, it means give up. But often people mistakenly think that when people use this word, I have to give up my pleasure. I have to give up all the good things in life. No, that's not true. What renunciation means is give up the idea that they're going to make you happy. That's what we need to give up. Whether you've got pleasure, money, wealth, fame, reputation, that's not important. That's not the important thing. The important thing is our attitude to those things. And if we're pinning our hopes that money, pleasure, fame and good reputation is going to make us happy, we're in trouble. We're just going to suffer. So therefore, all this talk about renunciation means really give up the wrong attitude to these things. Give up the idea that they're the source of happiness and the source of suffering.
But you did say that it is needed for genuine happiness?
What's that? Because genuine happiness comes from within.
Yes.
So as long as we have the world view that happiness is coming from there, then we're never going to look in here we're never going to find genuine happiness.
Yeah, but is the outer happiness, how is it called?
Temporal happiness.
Is the temporal happiness in some way needed in order to have genuine happiness?
Yes, it's called conducive conditions to practice. Because if we're starving, we don't have a roof over our head, we're not going to be sitting there meditating, are we?
Yeah.
We need to take care of the basic things in life, food, shelter, clothing, medical, all that sort of things. That needs to be taken care of. So we need to have some good conditions to practice. Sure, absolutely. But if we are thinking that if we just get a little bit more money, a bit more pleasure, a bit more fame, that then we're really going to be happy, then we're in trouble. We're just going to suffer. Okay. Right, so let's have a look at this 7 cause and effect method now. Very briefly, because I want to focus mainly on the second approach, which I think for many of us in the modern world is a more effective and more powerful approach. And it's the very first step here in the 7 cause and effect method that for many of us can be a little bit problematic. And the first step is to see everyone as our mother. And to be able to do that, there is an assumption of a belief in rebirth. Because in this life we had a mother, in a previous life we had a mother. If we keep going back like that, using that line of reasoning, we can understand that everyone has been our mother at some point in our history. And the idea of seeing everyone as our mother is because generally, at least historically, the mother is the person who benefited us most in our life. They carried us in the womb, they gave birth to us, they looked after us as a baby, fed us, clothed us, and probably helped in education as well. And so the idea being, this first step is to get a sense of closeness to everyone. But if you have no belief in rebirth, then that logic would be difficult. And secondly, unfortunately, in our modern world, often people have issues with their mother. So if we see everyone as our mother, we might start hating everybody. So if you have issues with your mother, you can change that to father, brother, sister, teacher, grandmother. Probably not mother-in-law. So then if we can see everyone as our mother based on that line of reasoning, then the second step is to remember their kindness. How all mother sentient beings have been so kind to us. Again, in carrying in the womb and giving birth and feeding us, clothing us, helping us when we needed help. And by reflecting on their kindness, that will lead to the third step of cultivating a wish to repay that kindness. And then, on cultivating a wish to repay their kindness, that will lead to step 4 and 5. Which is great love or great loving kindness and great compassion. So this word great here, remember, loving kindness and compassion is simply the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness causes, be free of suffering causes. But the word great here takes that to another level. Not only just wishing here, in this case, mother sentient beings to have happiness and causes and be free of suffering as causes, it means that we will actively do whatever we can to place mother sentient beings in happiness and freedom from suffering. So this great sort of takes that to the next level. We're doing as much as we can to help mother sentient beings. But then we can take these two to another level. And that is often what's called altruistic intention. And what this is to make it our personal responsibility to help liberate all mother sentient beings from suffering. I myself alone am going to take that personal responsibility. That's a huge step. But then, of course, if we make that responsibility here, then we can see, well, what can I do to help mother sentient beings now? I've got my own problems and suffering and mental afflictions. So if I really want to be able to begin to do this, I need to achieve full awakening, eliminate all mental afflictions and suffering, and fully develop my positive qualities. Then I can really be effective in starting to do this. So that's step 7, which of course is bodhicitta. So bodhicitta, again, is that aspiration for full enlightenment so that we can begin to help effectively liberate all other sentient beings from suffering. So this is the 7 cause and effect, and that's the technique historically that was most widely taught, because the second technique, which we're going to focus on more now and tomorrow as well, was considered a little bit difficult for the average person. But I think in our modern world, actually it's probably more effective. And also this method, you may find it a bit challenging because of that first step. But any questions on that before we move to the second technique? Okay, so let's look at the second approach. It's a long title, Equalizing Exchanging Self with Others, and it has 5 steps. And the first step is equalizing self with others. And this has a little bit a similar idea to what we looked at yesterday, this idea of equanimity. And here, equalizing self with others is to appreciate that we are all equal in wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. My happiness and freedom from suffering is no more important than anyone else. We're all equal in that regard. And so that's what equalizing self with others means. And then on the basis of that, the second step is to reflect on the disadvantages of self-cherishing. And here this word self-cherishing is another word for the selfish, self-centered attitude that sees my happiness as more important than the happiness of anyone else. Now, it sometimes seems like this selfish attitude actually is our friend bringing us happiness. And unfortunately, our modern world seems to promote this